I first met Governor Raghuram Rajan at the RBI headquarters in Mumbai a few months before 2014's disruptive elections. It was my ritualistic business editor's call on every central bank governor since the early 90s. Now, Governor Rajan was exceedingly cordial and friendly, and, well, given the state of play, we hardly spoke about any economics. It was politics all the way, and I shall claim privilege on what was discussed. But I must say, it was an altogether agreeable encounter. Later, when Governor Rajan concluded his RBI stint in a somewhat controversial manner, and he went back to teaching at Chicago's Booth School, I kept pace with his columns and his interviews. And since I had been stridently critical of India's demonetization, I must say I enjoyed reading between the lines, as Professor Rajan wrote, with remarkable restraint, but with occasional flashes of candor about an economic misadventure that he was thought to have opposed when in office on Mint Street. So when my friends at the Asia Society asked me to facilitate a webinar with Professor Rajan on vaccines, jobs and governance in post-pandemic India, I jumped at the opportunity to touch base again. So we logged in 10 minutes before the scheduled hour for a practice session. There was very genial chatter about whether we had the wrong topic for the day, since everybody was consumed by the tragedy unfolding in Afghanistan. But we said, well, let's stay the course of our topic. Strangely, the conversation veered towards artificial intelligence, AI. I shared an anecdote about how I was stunned when a computer program scanned a dozen articles on Afghanistan, and it picked up the best lines and it strung those together into a remarkably lucid machine-written piece. I was about to call it machine plagiarizing when Professor Rajan smilingly said, "But isn't that how all of us write our pieces, Raghav?" Everybody broke out in laughter, and whatever little awkwardness there might have been, it just vanished. And we were ready to go. I will share 3 critical strands of thought that emerged at the discussion. After stumbling through an early phase of trial and error, the global vaccination program has stabilized, but it's still astonishingly uneven. Poor countries have barely covered even a tenth of vulnerable citizens. Unfortunately, nobody has taken global leadership of the vaccination program. Each country is focusing only on protection within its borders. Now, while that's an understandable impulse, it's also very myopic, hugely myopic in such a terrifyingly contagious pandemic. It's also astounding how the world has ignored the compelling cost-benefit ratio of mass-producing vaccines. It costs hardly anything to manufacture billions of doses when compared to the trillions of dollars saved in medical care and human deaths. Perhaps the world's governments, they could have pooled their resources to pay pharma companies and then universalize vaccine IPRs, vaccine intellectual property rights, to permit mass production anywhere and everywhere. Now, a similarly open architecture is needed to make vaccine passports globally effective. It's quite unfathomable that countries are creating what I would call artificial ravines as opposed to a wide, frictionless highway. For instance, the UK says it will accept only those who are vaccinated in its NHS. It's even differentiating between AstraZeneca doses produced in India versus other geographies. The US says only those who've got American vaccines will make the cut. China is doing likewise. Once again, a robust global leadership is needed to enforce fair, undifferentiated, undiscriminatory standards for vaccine passports across the world. Perhaps the only benign fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a lessening inequality in the developed world, especially in America. Now, since rich governments have transferred unprecedented amounts of cash, trillions of dollars, to ordinary citizens, income levels at the bottom of the pyramid have risen in several instances. Therefore, with personal consumption and lifestyle costs falling, people have saved more, and that has added to their assets and their wealth. But alas, this is a very narrow phenomenon. Elsewhere, in Africa and Asia, inequalities have become deeper, more entrenched among poor and unemployed citizens, and between industrialized and laggard economies. Now, these wounds, which could lead to street protests and radicalization as the crisis abates, shall pose unfathomable challenges to resource constrained governments, including ours. Think about it. School children who would have lost 2 crucial years of early education and whose learning abilities, therefore, may have regressed by almost 3 to 4 years, because children tend to forget easily. Now, this could become the black hole of this pandemic unless their learning skills are rapidly restored. A whole generation of what I would call educationally disabled people could become an inestimable drag on global growth for the next 6 decades. Now, given the sorry state of education in India, this black hole is the scariest unknown of the post-pandemic world. Finally, the scourge of protectionism. Now, it can be understood as a reflex in the face of such an extreme global crisis. Countries do tend to withdraw into cocoons and they shut out trade and travel. But unfortunately, India was in the grip of a protectionist creep much before the pandemic, as we raised import tariffs and pumped cash into chosen sectors to subsidize a state-orchestrated manufacturing and export thrust. And that's also known as the production-linked incentive, PLI, schemes of Atmanirbhar or self-reliant India. Now, while such an injection of synthetic adrenaline, it does create a temporary high, witness India's spiking exports and rising share of domestic manufactures, by itself, it hardly ensures a sustained long-term advantage. For that to happen, the country needs to alter its research and technological genes, its skills base and productivity profile. However, a high tariff regime could be the very antithesis here, because it slaps a tax on exports and on domestic demand. So instead of blindly cloning China's manufacturing miracle through the 90s, India could pivot towards the emerging trade in services and digital products. Instead of retreating behind tariff walls, India should deploy its strengthening economic muscle and diplomatic heft, especially among the concert of developed democracies, to write new rules to globalize services that could engineer an Indian miracle. Of course, India also needs to grapple with a toxic concentration of economic power within its domestic economy. Now, when combined with creeping protectionism, this creates a lose-lose double whammy. India's competitive architecture needs much more teeth to ensure that conglomerates do not swallow smaller companies to create monopolies or oligopolies in key markets. Our watchdog needs to shake off its lethargy and get going as a feared, effective protector of competitive markets. It's equally critical to enable smaller and informal outfits to become larger, formal challengers to the big boys. So, to become a truly efficient economy, we need to throw a double switch. We need to curb protectionism across borders and create competitive markets within.